Shalom, a good day. This is Rabbi Sachs with the Chai Academy, coming to you from the Chai Center. Chai Academy, of course, for those of you that know, is a daily class on topics of Jewish interest. It could be an isolated class, it could be a course. Either way, each class is going to be you'll be able to understand each class from the context even without seeing the day before. So we have been speaking about modern day Israel. However, today we're going to take a hiatus, and because tonight is Purim, so I think it's imperative that we talk about Purim, and we talk about the laws, the customs, the insights, etc. Purim Sameach from Israel. Hi, Daniel. So the today is the fast of Esther, Tainit Esther. And it is a fast day. It begins at 5 in the morning, ends at just after 6 tonight. And we fast in commemoration of the story of Purim, that the Jewish people had to fast because they were in dire straits, and they said, you know what, we have to repent, we have to go return to our inner selves, become better people, self-reflect. And therefore they fasted, which helps you think, because you're not around food. You occupy your day with Torah, and you occupy your day with more spiritual pursuits. And then tonight begins Purim. So Purim is as you'll see, Purim basically is a story. It's a deep story. And it has an incredible message. Purim is not a biblical holiday. Rosh Hashanah is a biblical holiday. Yom Kippur is a biblical Passover, Sukkot, Shavuot, right? They're biblical holidays. Purim is a rabbinical holiday. Essentially, it's our offering of a thank you to God. And Hanukkah is the same idea, is that we offer a thank you to God for saving us, creating miracles, sustaining us, etc. So it's a rabbinical holiday, and tonight we have one mitzvah, and tomorrow on the day of Purim we have 4 mitzvahs. But before we get into the mitzvahs, I just want to talk a little bit about Purim and the story. So we know the story of Purim from something called the Megillah, Esther's Megillah, Esther's scroll. It's called Megillat Esther. So Esther, she was the queen at that time of Persia, modern day Iran, and she was she lived through the lows and the highs as the queen. She herself was Jewish, even though the king had no idea. He married a Jewess, and she was the queen. And when she saw this story unfold, which we'll discuss, she said, we got to write this down because this is incredible. The Purim story took over a decade for it to play out. And that's why Esther, who's the heroine of the Megillah story, and Mordechai, her uncle, who is the hero of the Megillah story, they said, we need to write it down because it took over 10 years, because it took a decade to unfold. It was Chag Purim to you, Susan, because it took a decade to unfold, and it really you wouldn't necessarily connect the dots. And Esther Mordechai says, this is what happened is incredible and has to be written down for posterity. In a nutshell, and this is viewing it from the eyes of Esther, and because she wrote the Megillah. So Achashverosh, her husband, who was the king of Persia, and it was Persia and surrounding areas. He had many. He was the king over many lands and had many fiefdoms, and he was at the pinnacle of his leadership. And he decided, in celebration of yet another year anniversary of him being king, that he was going to make a party. And it was going to be a party like no other party. And the king spared no expense. And it must have been like the COVID stimulus, the one that's coming down the pike, a couple of trillion. This is kind of what it was as it's listed in the Megillah. Gold and silver, and it was such opulence and all food that you can get, and whatever you wanted was. But the king was very philanthropic and very generous. This party, this mishter, as it's called, lasted for many, many, many days. One of the days, the king summoned his queen. Her name was Vashti. Vashti was not one of the nicest people I ever met, or you'll ever meet. Vashti was a horror. Vashti was smug. Vashti was cruel, and Vashti was left a lot to be desired as a human. So the king summoned her, and he said, "I want to show you off to the esteemed VIP crowd." Now, there's commentaries. They said he wanted her to appear naked or quasi-naked. But from the Megillah, it's seeming I want to show you off. And she was repulsed. And she said, "Who, me? I'm not coming. I'm not a doll. I'm not just a showcase. I'm not a Vegas, dancer. No, I'm not walking on your tabletops." And she refused. And the king was drunk and crazed. How dare she refuse me? I'm the king. He said, "What should we do with her?" And they decided that she deserved the death penalty for treason, for sedition. And she died. She was killed. She was murdered. And now the king needed a new queen. That's kind of the first chapter and a half. So you see, the queen died. Vashti died. The king said, "I need a new queen. And I don't want just any queen. I want the most beautiful maiden in the lands, in my fiefdoms." And the king summoned every virgin. And he summoned them, and they were brought to the palace, and they were treated royally, and they were treated beautifully. And when it came their turn, they met with the king, and the king slept with them. So he had a different virgin every time, every night. And then finally, he was Esther, who was a virgin. She was not married, and she was brought to the king, and the king slept with her. Couldn't do anything about it unless you commit suicide, right? And the king slept with her, and he said right away, "You're my one. You are to be my queen." And the campaign of finding a wife for the king was over. So he chose Esther. Esther was Jewish. He had no idea she was Jewish. She was told by her uncle Mordechai, do not in any circumstance tell him that you're Jewish. He's an anti-Semite, possibly, or it's just best left unsaid. So she didn't. Chapter 2. Chapter 3 begins where Mordechai, he was Esther's uncle. He always hung around the palace. so he could get a glimpse of her, perhaps take a private chat with her. And he heard two of the king's guards plotting to murder the king. He quickly told Esther. Esther said, I was informed by a fellow Mordechai that there's a plot to poison you. And Bigsan and Zeresh, you too, Bigsan, right? And the king killed them, and the king was saved. And the king said, we have to do something for Mordechai, right? We're going to do something. I have to think about it, but he saved my life. It's an important part of the story because Mordechai was on the king's radar, and because Mordechai saved the king's life, the king reciprocated, as we'll hear. The king's chief of staff, Haman, who was an arch enemy of the Jews. He came from a long line of arch enemies of the Jews. Hated the Jewish people, and in particular he hated Mordechai, as the Megillah tells us that there was a decree when the chief of staff walks in the street, people need to bow. Mordechai said, I bow to no man. I don't bend the knee. I bow only to God. And it drove Haman crazy because everybody else was compliant with the law of the land, and Mordechai was not. And he couldn't stand he could not stand Haman couldn't stand Mordechai. So he goes to the king and he says, look, there's a nation, a small nation, who keep to themselves, who are very they're isolated, they're not involved, and they're just a drain on society. Right? King, I want to do away with them. I want to just pick a day where we can do away with them, and we can get their riches, take the spoils will be dedicated to the crown, and just they're not worth it. And the king said, well, you're my chief of staff, go ahead. He didn't care. He was a tyrant, and so it was written and it was signed with the king's ring that on a certain day chosen by Haman. And the way Haman chose was he actually it was a lottery. He had days of the month, 1 through 31 or 1 through 30, whatever it was back then, names of months, and he had them in 2 boxes. He took them out, and the Hebrew date was the 14th of Adar. That was the Hebrew date that was chosen that this is the day the Jewish people will be killed. And the name Purim actually means lottery, because that's the day Haman chose. Haman chose the 14th day of Adar, and it basically was saying this is the spirits have spoken, and this is the day. So the holiday is called Purim, lottery, because Haman saw it as just a random thing. God and Mordechai, they saw it as something that there's no happenstance, there's no randomness. This day was chosen for a reason. Esther heard all about what Haman was going to do, and she was crazed. And she told Mordechai, and Mordechai put on sackcloth, and Mordechai started to sit shiva in mourning for what was going to happen in a few months to the Jewish people. Once again, this story took years. And Mordechai told Esther, it's time for you to reveal whom you are. You got to tell him you're a Jewess. You got to tell him that your people, your tribe, your nation is about to be slaughtered in 10 months from now. So Esther said, I can't just go as a queen, I can't go unless summoned. So Mordechai said, malarkey, you gotta go. So Esther said, I'll tell you what, I will go. I will go in 3 days. But we need to gather in prayer, in fasting, and in prayer. And we have to get the kids and bring them to the synagogues. And we have to pray to God that my encounter with the king is successful. Because if he gets angry at me, he's liable to kill me. And the only way I know that I've captured him, his heart, is if he extends the scepter. If he doesn't extend the scepter after I walk in and announce, I'm a dead woman walking. So Mordechai did that, and he gathered everybody, all the lands, and he started to say, we got to pray. And that was, which is an interesting approach, because you would think the first thing you would do when you're threatened is what we do today, right? SNL makes a stupid anti-Semitic comment. What do? You stand up and fight it. You yell from the treetops. You diplomatically, you go to this one and this senator and that senator, right? And you say, this has got to be stopped. We have to put our foot down. Anti-Semitism in the Senate, anti-Semitism in the world, and anti-Semitism, this, that, and the other, right? We're not going to take this lying down. The first thing they did was not that. Diplomacy came later. The first thing they did was to pray, to fast, and to gather, which is very telling. That is primarily the first response of the Jew. Ethereal, spiritual. It's not to fight first. First thing that you got to do is reach out to God. Here's where Mordechai's favor for the king, saving the king, came into play. Haman had said, you know what? I can't wait to kill the Jewish people, but I got to kill this guy first. So he decides that he's going to go pay a late night visit to the king to talk to him, right? And that night the king had insomnia, and he was going through the book, the book of merits, a book that was placed on the shelf about who did the king a favor. And he was reading about Mordechai. Haman walks in, which is their arch enemies, and he was going to ask the king permission to string up Mordechai, kill Mordechai, hang him from a tree. And Haman enters, and the king says, what should be done to a person who saved my life? So Haman, what should be done to a royal person, somebody who's there for me? Haman thought it was himself. He said, well, you got to dress him in the finest, and you got to parade him around the streets and say, honor is given to a man that honored the king. And Haman really thought it was about himself. So the king said, Haman, you're correct. You're the chief of staff. Go to this fellow, Mordechai HaYehudi, Mordechai the Jew, and parade him around town. Haman already knew that there's trouble, because this happened out of the blue. He wants to kill Mordechai, and he couldn't. In the end, he had to honor Mordechai. Just an incredible twist of what seemingly is fate, but we know it's not fate. We know it's not. We know that this is planned from God, or rather, it is fate, right? But a godly fate. 3 days are up. Esther goes to the king, and she says, I need to speak to you. And the king extended the scepter. He goes, what do you want, my darling, my sweet, my honey bunch? What can I do for you? Half my kingdom. And she said, I want you and your chief of staff to join me for dinner. Just you three. Very unusual. The king said, done. Haman had just got home from dragging Mordechai's horse, and he was the messages from the king: get dressed. You're having dinner with Esther tonight. Esther and the king and the queen. He was so tickled pink. He was so happy. They had the dinner. Achashverosh says, anything you want to say, Esther? He goes, no, I want to do this again tomorrow night. Haman walked home, and he says, wow, 2 private audiences and dinner. I get invited by the king and queen for dinner. They're private, in the West Wing. The second night came. And Achashverosh said, Esther, what do you want? So he goes, there's a man that's trying to kill me. And he's trying to kill my family. And he's trying to kill my people. And Mordechai stood up and goes, what are you talking about? So he goes, yeah, it comes down to an individual. My very life is at stake and is threatened. So he said, who? So she said, him. And Mordechai and Achashverosh was so overcome that he left. He left the room. At that moment, Haman sees his house of cards crumbling, and Esther was laying, as they used to do. They used to recline and eat, and he bent over Esther. She was reclining, begging for his life. The king comes back and said, what are you doing with my wife? What are you doing with my wife? Kill him. So somebody said, there's actually a large tree nearby that Haman wanted to kill Mordechai on. Why don't we hang him? And the king said, done. Hang him and his kids. And they did. Achashverosh turns to Esther and says, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I had no idea anything. You're Jewish, the people. I didn't connect any dots. So she goes, I'm begging you, husband. I'm begging you, king. Rescind the decree. And he said, I can't. Once the decree is signed and delivered, I can't. But what I can tell you is that the crown will not get involved. Until then, the crown was going to get involved, and it was going to be the king's army as well as civilian militia. The king's army is no longer involved, and you let me know what you need in order to defend yourself. The day came, and there was a war. There was a battle. It was less because now the crown, the army of the crown, the military was not involved, and actually the Jews were victorious. And they killed thousands of people. It doesn't say what the Jewish casualty was. And Esther says, can we do it again tomorrow? And they fought tomorrow. Esther then said, we got to write this down. From the king's party, from Vashti's death to Mordechai saving the king, and Haman seeking to destroy the people, but yet had to walk around Mordechai, and then Haman laying on my bed with me. This is a miracle, however enclosed in nature. It's a miracle that played out over 10 years. 10 years. But it's a miracle nonetheless. So she wrote it down. And she said, from now on and forever, comes Purim, we need to read the Megillah. What I just wrote. And he says, and in addition, Purim Day, you have to have a feast. And you have to be merry. And if you can handle alcohol, take a little bit. Be happy, even if you have to force it. If you can't take alcohol, can't hold your liquor, or you're recovering, don't. And then you have to give gifts to the poor. And you have to give gifts of food to your friend and to your neighbor. Right? And that's what we do. Those are the laws. Now, this took place between the first and second temple, which is a great question, Lenny, because Esther had a king. Esther had a child with a king. That child was very instrumental in building the second temple. But that wasn't written in the Megillah because it didn't happen yet. On Purim, this is the bottom line. You have to hear the Megillah tonight. The Chai Center, we're doing it inside and outside. You have to hear the Megillah tonight. You have to hear the Megillah tomorrow at some time. If you go to thechaicenter.com, there's a list of different times. Tomorrow, you have to have a meal at some point during the day, not Shabbat meal, during the day. You have to wash your hands and eat bread. It's a Sudat mitzvah. You have to give gifts to the poor. We can do it for you if you wish. We have a discretionary fund that we give to people that need it. And you also have to send gifts of food, and she writes Esther gifts of food. So you can send a hamantash and an apple. You can send, and it has to be ready to eat. So it can't be raw chicken. And that's how you celebrate Purim. It also says that you are very philanthropic on that day. On Purim day, anybody asks you, give. Give, because this is a day of celebration. It's an incredibly lofty day, and it was called Purim. And we have another holiday that's very lofty, that's called Yom HaKippurim, Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur means the day of atonement, but it also means a day that is Kippurim, like Purim. And it's brought down that if we celebrate on Purim and do the mitzvahs, it's just like fasting and praying on Yom Kippur. Kippur, like Purim. So these are this is some of this is the mainstay. These are the laws and the customs. Now, the reason why on Purim we eat hamantash. Hamantash is basically, it's a cookie dough that's filled inside with different types of sweet. It can be poppy seed, it could be chocolate chips, it could be apricot, mango, it could be blueberry, it could be anything, prune. Different people make different ones. And the idea is that you can't see the fruit. It's covered by the cookie dough. But you can expose it. That's what Esther saw. She saw a hidden miracle. But if you're wise and you connect the dots, put together the jigsaw puzzle, you see God's hand in it in every single way. In the Megillah, there's no mention of God. Not one mention of God. Unusual for a Jew, unusual for a Jewish book, a holy book. But that was the idea. God's revealed presence was not there. It all happened naturally. It all happened organically. But God was clearly involved. As Esther writes, look at this story. How could you say God is not involved? But it's not apparent. And only God can be involved and non-involved at the same time. thechaycenter.com/Purim. You could find all details. We're having a dinner, Purim dinner. We have Megillah readings. We can help you with the tzedakah to the poor. We can help you with the tzedakah to not the poor, but to the Chai Center. You're supposed to give on that day in addition to the poor. And we can help you with Purim baskets to give from one to the next. thechaycenter.com. Enjoy those brownies sent to hamantash, and what a great idea. God bless, and be healthy, be safe, be happy. Purim is a day of unbridled celebration. Shalom, shalom.